All right, I think we're going to get started in our next session. I hope you've all gotten a chance to grab some coffee, a snack, and looking forward to continuing our conversation with our next session on Imperial Entanglements. And so just a reminder to panelists, each paper will have about 15 minutes. I'll be keeping time, so look out for time cues. We'll do introductions at the start for each of the presenters, so after, when it's your turn, just feel free to come up on the stage, and then we'll have time for conversation with everyone after all papers have been presented. So leading our conversation for this session is Geoff Bill, who is assistant professor in the Department of History at the University of Delaware. His first book, which is coming out soon, is Indexing the Indigenous, Plants, Peoples, and Empire, which examines the history of indigenous plant names and their circulations in 19th and 20th century botany and anthropology. So I couldn't think of a better person to facilitate the conversation for this session than Geoff. So Geoff, come on up and introduce the panelists, and we'll go from there.
All right, hello. Good to see you. It's a real pleasure for me to introduce this panel of really exciting papers, which I've had the pleasure of reading, but of course I have not had the pleasure of seeing them presented, and I've missed out, I think, on what will be some fantastic images that will really help all of us. Anyway, to introduce the presenters, I'm going to introduce all three, and then we'll dive right into it. Alexander Clayton is a doctoral candidate in history at the University of Michigan, and also a dissertation fellow at the McNeil Center for Early American Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. His research and writing explore the fields of animal studies, science and technology studies, and environmental history. His doctoral dissertation examines the animal trade in the 18th and 19th century British Empire, and also shows how zoological collecting rested on colonization, indigenous knowledge, and the networks and labor of the slave trade. He will join the University of Vermont as an assistant professor of global environmental history this fall, which sounds amazing. Congratulations. Eleanor Pschirrer-West, did I pronounce that correctly, Eleanor? Pschirrer, thank you. I promised I would do it justice, and then I utterly failed. So thank you, Eleanor. Eleanor graduated from William and Mary in 2020 with a degree in art history, concentrating in critical curatorial studies, and a minor in religious studies. In 2023, Eleanor completed her master's degree in British and European history, 1700 to 1850, at the University of Oxford, Wolfson College. She is currently the curatorial assistant at the Madison Museum of Contemporary Art in Madison, Wisconsin, which also sounds fantastic. Her major research interest is the formation of identity in relation to the environment, which she has explored via the history of British cultural responses to Arctic exploration in the 19th century. Our final speaker is Marcy Norton, who is an associate professor of history at the University of Pennsylvania, specializing in the history of science, ecology, and interspecies relationships in the Atlantic world after 1492. Her publications include Sacred Gifts, Profane Pleasures, A History of Tobacco and Chocolate in the Atlantic World, which is out with Cornell University Press. And most recently, she has published, just this year, actually, The Tame and the Wild, People and Animals After 1492, which is with Harvard University Press. So with that, I will yield the floor to our first speaker, Alexander Clayton.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for what's already been such a fantastic conference. I want to thank Thomas and the organizers, and particularly Adriana and the APS who've supported this project for a number of years now. And hopefully my talk today can act as a bit of a bridge between the last panel on Philadelphia and kind of explore some of Philadelphia's connections with European empires in the 19th century. For most of the 19th century, visitors entering the lobby at Philadelphia's Academy of Natural Sciences would have come face to face with the skeleton of an Indian rhinoceros. A prize of the Academy's collection, the specimen had been hunted, skinned, and dried many miles from its final resting place. Acquired in 1831, the Academy's Department of Comparative Anatomy celebrated the arrival of a perfect skeleton of the Indian rhinoceros, brought home from the interior of Hindustan by Dr. Burra. And as we've seen in many of the talks today and yesterday, death, preservation, and stillness allowed for the efficient sorting of the world, offering transportable insights into foreign lands being colonized and exploited. However, as Dr. Marmaduke Burra docked in Philadelphia in 1830, he also carried a more unruly cargo, a living rhinoceros, the skeleton's son. This was not a specimen that could simply be shot and killed, but rather had to be pursued, captured, restrained, transported, and nurtured. Using Burra's papers split between the American Philosophical Society, the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, the Clements Library, and the East India Company papers, I want to explore the various colonial and environmental forces that rendered one of the world's strongest animals into a living commodity, as well as the marginalized knowledge and labor that made the global animal trade possible. So to structure this talk, I want to invite you to come with me as we follow Burra's rhinoceros from Assam to Philadelphia and discover how British colonization rendered new animals into governable and entirely ownable subjects. Where hunting embodied the expansion of the imperial project, I argue that capture represented something far deeper. It signified rule, governance, infrastructure, and more consolidated forms of colonial power. Like other American merchants in Calcutta, Burra had become increasingly desperate after the collapse of Bengal's indigo market, a crash that had seen others diversify into textiles, hides, and a growing number of live animals for display in America. By 1830, the US population had more than tripled to 17 million since the beginning of the century, with theaters and traveling shows committing larger sums to entertain an increasingly urbanized, diffused, and diverse population. Animals represented a rare but risky opportunity to turn a considerable profit. And as Burra closed out his final year as the United States consul in Calcutta, he saw the rhinoceros as part of his patriotic duty to share Indian nature with the American people, though he was mostly interested in profit. The first problem was capture. The consul used his diplomatic connections to reach out to Captain Alexander Davidson, who served as agent to the Governor General on the northeast frontier, placing him at the heart of the rhinoceros's habitat and on the front lines of the East India Company's military expeditions into Assam. While British power had been relatively secure in Bengal, Assam formed a key target as the company looked north towards the Himalaya. And you can see on the map that the area in the northeast to the British is relatively uncharted. And Davidson formed part of a British effort to understand and govern the region. The captain commanded a group of sepoys, East India Company soldiers hired from within India as native regiments. Using that labor, he supplemented his income by sending a range of monkeys, birds, and rhinoceros to paying British naturalists. Describing his use of sepoy labor when acquiring bird skins, he celebrated how any acclaim would always go to him, writing that, quote, "They will have all the trouble, I the credit, quite just this." Yet even while British and American traders reaped the social and economic benefits of Indian labor and knowledge, failures remained directly blamed on the local population and their perceived laziness and ignorance regarding the surrounding environment. Assam's leading military physician, Dr. John Leslie, responded to Burra with little hope of obtaining a rhino alive, writing that, quote, "Since my arrival in Assam, I've procured fewer specimens than I had anticipated. This, I believe, chiefly arises from the apathy and race of the natives, who can scarce be seduced to make any exertion. So just as capture asserted a hierarchy between British vigor and Indian lethargy, just as capture asserted a hierarchy between colonial powers and environment, failure established a similar hierarchy between vigor and lethargy." However, this was a direct reference towards Assamese knowledge in particular. The British quote-unquote discovery of tea in the region in 1823 initiated a growing military project, but also what the East India Company considered to be a cultivating and civilizing mission. As this print shows, This involved replacing the wild Assam plant with a more civilized system of tea cultivation, as well as spending considerable sums to hire Chinese tea makers to train Assamese workers. The system was built on a cultural and eventually a legal assertion that the indigenous population could and should not manage this perceived wilderness. It was a worldview that upheld the British Empire as a whole. The rhinoceros was seen as a part of this wild and untamed nature, ripe for cultivation. They were also an agricultural pest, and the more rhinoceros that were extracted and killed, the better the tea harvest. So as the tea monoculture spread across Assam in the 1830s and 40s, rhinoceros became an unlikely byproduct of this environmental turmoil. But there was a big difference between capturing and hunting. For such large and strong animals, it was most effective to isolate the young by simply killing the larger protective adults, a process made easier by the garrison that Davidson had at his disposal. Writing to Burra, Davidson informed the merchant that, quote, "We have shot a large female rhinoceros, but alas, although the young one is very small, we've not been able to secure it yet. I imagine that we shall be able to do this." And his regiment called the calf a couple of days later. The next step was transportation. By the time Davidson wrote again, the calf and its dead mother's skeleton had already been placed aboard an East India Company prison barge. The boat carried Indian military prisoners on the Brahmaputra River in Assam, part of a growing carceral system that established company rule. Tied by its legs to prevent any sudden movements, the confined lower deck worked perfectly for confining an animal deemed equally unruly. The calf had been covered in sores from its capture, with the captain warning that, quote, "It would not be prudent to leave him at the mercy of the blue fleas and his native groom, the former being very attentive, the latter the reverse." Assamese apathy was once again to blame for the animal's poor state, not because of the severe physical abuse that it had suffered. Yet it was local knowledge that offered the most guarantees of ensuring suitable food, treatment, and care for the rhinoceros on its journey. The keeper advised Burra to prepare a mix of hay, wild sugarcane, and ferns, as well as 6 gallons of water per day to successfully transplant the animal from its marshy environment. Indian rhinos feed on over 150 different tree, grass, and shrub species, and it was clear that the Assamese keeper understood this far more than Davidson, who initially suggested ship biscuits. Burra's papers feature a 500 rupee payment to Davidson for the rhinoceros, which at around £65 far exceeded the captain's monthly earnings. Once the merchant had paid for the animal, his attention turned to reducing risk. He paid another 500 rupees for the animal's shipment aboard the ship Georgian, a journey that took 5 months and carried the rhinoceros 15,000 miles. And you can see the receipt here on the left. And on the right, you can see his partnership agreement with a fellow Philadelphia merchant, James Amory, sharing the costs, risks, and potential rewards 50-50. Such agreements were essential because shipping mortality rates remained among animals remained at around 50% for much of the 18th and 19th centuries, and were particularly high when crossing the equator 2 times and colder Atlantic waters. If the rhinoceros survived, Burra anticipated that his acquisition could earn him $20,000, a 3,000% return on his initial investment. However, the American frenzy for rhinoceros forced him to lower his expectations, with a fellow animal trader informing him that, quote, "The value which you've placed on the animals is far above what they would be worth. $3,000 was more realistic, given that 2 had already arrived in North America." Orangutans became the next big market in 1832, followed by boa constrictors in 1836, and giraffes after that. It was a constant quest for novelty that crafted ever more global and extractive forms of trade. By the time the brutalized infant rhinoceros arrived in Philadelphia, Burra advertised a radically different animal to the public and potential buyers. His sketch shows a fantasy, an orientalized imagery of what the rhinoceros could be rather than what it was. The calf measured only 3 feet high and was still without its horn. The presence of an Indian man on its back was a complete fiction. The accompanying description stressed that Though stupid and savage by nature, the rhinoceros is not altogether incapable of domestication. It was a vision that mirrored British aspirations regarding the cultivation of humans and animals alike, part of an improvement of Assam's nature and its culture. Yet what Burra actually owned was a shadow, an animal in such poor health that he would never receive the $3,000 that he'd hoped for, and he instead incurred 4 months of expensive keep while trying to find a buyer, eventually selling the rhinoceros to the Zoological Institute of New York in January 1831. It's likely that the eventual price was in the hundreds rather than the thousands. And here you can see a broadside advertisement for the Institute's touring menagerie, with large text to draw the public in, as well as detailed descriptions of the animal's origins and features. The poster described how the rhinoceros had, quote, been found in the foothills of the Himalaya in a cultivated field, having, quote, strayed from its natural protector. The paternal narrative belies the brutal reality, just as the description of a cultivated field emphasized a far broader human and environmental project being implemented in the region. The Institute were also forced to offer a disclaimer. Quote, the growth of its horn is much retarded as it continually thumps its head against the bars of its cage. Even as the poster advertised the fabled unicorn, the processes of transportation and display had rendered the animal almost unrecognizable. Capture was far more damaging to a specimen than a bullet hole, and Burra quickly received an offer of $500 for the rhinoceros's dead mother's skeleton, which made its way to the Academy of Natural Sciences. And as we saw in all of the diorama galleries yesterday as we walked through, the dead could be far more perfect and far more lively than the living. Given that most rhinoceros were acquired when young, it was common for their horns to never develop. Here you can see a 1790 display of a rhinoceros or a unicorn at the Extra Exchange Menagerie. And while the decorative print shows the calf without its horn, the person who owned the print has added it in with a pencil. But it's a sign that as merchants and naturalists pushed the rhinoceros into a commodity and scientific object, the rhinoceros pushed back, and that the more showmen and naturalists promised this authentic, truthful, objective display of animal life, the further they got from it. An Indian rhinoceros would not be bred in captivity until 1956, a factor which contributed to the continued hunting and extraction of the species to its near extinction. Even in menageries such as the Zoological Society of London, which were celebrated for their enclosures and scientific approach, reproduction occurred among just a handful of their animals every year, all while thousands died. So attention remained on capture. By the end of the 19th century, the German trader Karl Hagenbeck claimed an increasingly dominant position in the global animal trade, selling animals from within and beyond the British Empire to zoos and circuses alike. The dealer's letterhead, shown here, reveals how the animal trade remained rooted in a deeply racialized imperial project. In an ark-like procession, Hagenbeck's agent directs a convoy of African animals and people, both herded into subservient and subhuman positions. Zoos and menageries remained dependent on North African slavery well into the 20th century, and in turn, broadcast an imperial project that rested on racial difference and ownership. The ability to capture, transport, and eventually reproduce the full complexity of animal life revealed the very heights of this imperial confidence. Through the histories of colonial expansion, plantation agriculture, and human subjugation, we discover how animals were increasingly placed within global commercial reach. From Assam to Philadelphia, it's possible to see how the animal trade carried these messages to audiences, relaying these imperial categories of savagery and improvement. Those same systems of improvement have now rendered many species entirely extinct. And my talk today has shown that how the preservation of life remained rooted in these imperial and scientific practices rooted in deadly exploitation. Visit any number of zoos across the United States and you won't view a rhinoceros with its horn. Surrounded by concrete and steel, they continue to grind down their horns far more bluntly than in the wild. Still today, zoological displays, and arguably zoological conservation not only exposes to a variety of animals from around the world, but also to implicit subjective lessons about power, race, expertise, gender, and difference. In sum, the Menagerie reveals the growth of a paradox that we continue to live under today. A site that promised harmony in an objective wild, but was instead the product of human destruction and control. It presents the image of a nature that does not exist. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me here. It's very exciting, and I've really enjoyed everything so far, and I'm excited to present to you today. Let's see. The preface to William Hurton's 1856 novel, The Doomed Ship, lays out the stakes of the search for the Northwest Passage in the 19th century. Quote, apart from all other considerations, the various Arctic explorations have been more valuable for their contributions to geography, natural history, and astronomy, and in a moral point of view, they exhibit transcendent examples of British skill, courage, and endurance. This grand claims disjunction with the plot and the very title of the book is an irony to which Hurton seems oblivious. It is an irony at the heart of the British search for the Northwest Passage, an endeavor that had grand claims and little material reward. Yet the allure remained. Somewhere on the passage home, the grisly details and the harsh realities of polar exploration were spun into narratives of bravery, Christian perseverance, and national achievement. By 1840, it was clear that the Northwest Passage had no practical use as a trading route. So why return again and again, both physically and in literature, to a landscape that held no great wealth of resources? The answer lies in the perceived mutability of the Arctic landscape. Potentially even more so than other areas of imperial expansion, the Arctic was seen as a tabula rasa for British ideas to be projected upon in the media they created related to the Arctic. There was a timelessness to the Arctic, in part due to the inability to make a mark of presence, such that it seemed that there was no presence and no history to the place. Alluringly desolate, it could be fashioned into anything Britain needed it to be through the powerful force of imperial imagination. My talk today is part of a larger piece of research on formulations of the Arctic in Britain from roughly 1830 to 1890. That larger work includes a more wide-reaching selection of sources, including panoramas, tableaus, and decorative arts that illustrated the Arctic, a few examples of which are here. But today I'm going to focus on the formulation of the Arctic in adventure novels, as they speak to the major themes found in other Arctic media I've surveyed. Literature played a fundamental role in constructing the British imagination of the Arctic, offering a primary means for the public to experience the distant and harsh landscapes vicariously. Typical depictions of the Arctic emphasize the sublime elements of the landscape and the physical challenges of survival. The idea of a purifying wilderness was an important moral aspect of British exploration. The challenges presented by the landscape were believed to test the moral nature of explorers, and because of this, many understood the Arctic as a gauntlet that could either prove men as heroes or strip them of their sanity. In adventure literature, the Arctic landscape acts as a force that characters move against while it constantly shifts in form. More than other frontiers, the Arctic was defined by alterity and by its apparent blank vastness. One 1832 account, a narrative of discovery and adventure in the polar seas, described that in the Arctic, quote, nature is marked by the most stupendous features, and the forms which she assumes differ from her appearances in our milder latitudes almost as widely as if they belonged to another planet, end quote. Visual representations of the Arctic had to stress the sublime and alien elements of landscape, conjuring towering icebergs and desolate ice plains. A description that emphasizes the challenges of representing such a landscape, the Arctic was often described as a blank white space. This allowed authors and artists to fit it to whatever function they needed in narratives, sometimes providing a neutral backdrop for character drama, sometimes as an obstacle for characters to face, and sometimes being transformed into a land of pure fantasy with mystical powers. British cultural memory of the Arctic was shaped by literature and media that presented a filtered version of the Arctic, often created by people who had not experienced the place for themselves. Adventure literature from the period serves as a lens through which to explore the complex intersections of exploration, fiction, and national identity. The most famous literary representation of the Arctic in the 19th century is certainly Frankenstein, but specific Arctic adventure novels such as The Doomed Ship, Gordon Stable's The Cruise of the Snowbird from 1882, and Mrs. Chisholm's Perils of the Polar Sea from 1874, among others, dealt more extensively with the Arctic landscape. Additionally, post-Napoleonic interest in the Arctic was matched by growing literacy rates, and new technologies of mass communication made Arctic narratives widely available to the British reading public. Literary depictions of polar landscapes strongly appealed to Victorian readers. One such reader's account of Elisha Kane's narrative of exploration speaks to the evocative nature of the Arctic. In 1857, she wrote, "I am with the party in all their weary journeys, and when I turn to gaze on the dark, magnificent landscape, I can almost realize the solemn, the dreadful stillness of the Arctic light." The books themselves prime readers' imaginations, telling them to cast aside their assumptions. In a book, for which the sake of time I'm just going to call The Northern Regions, the author cautions readers to, quote, "You will not suppose these fields of ice to have resembled the ice which covers your pool in winter, and when I talk of land, you must not think of green fields. You must picture yourselves on abrupt and craggy rocks topped with snow." Inducing imagination in readers and visualizing the Arctic in paintings, tableaux, and commercial products was vital because the Arctic was experienced by so few within Britain. It was also a means of laying claims to land. Since the British public was so far removed from the Arctic both physically and due to a lack of similar experiences in wintry landscapes, media became a primary means to establish a cultural memory of the place. Often, authors' assertions of the Arctic expedition's values for British skill and endurance contrasted sharply with the grim stories depicted in the novels and the even harsher realities of the repeated failed British expeditions themselves. In 1845, the entire Franklin expedition was lost, and 129 men died stranded in the ice. Despite these repeated failures, the allure of the Arctic persisted due to the perceived mutability and imaginative potential of the landscape. This is sometimes briefly mentioned in the novels. In the Perils of the Polar Sea, the narrator explains that, quote, "Although the barren and hopeless nature of these voyages had pretty well been shown in the 300 years I have been describing to you, they do seem to have acquired a fascinating power over almost all of those who projected and took part in them." Over and over, failure was transformed into an idea of struggle that matched readers' taste for British heroism and romantic wilderness. More than just demonstrating British taste for wilderness landscapes, Arctic adventure literature is revealing of 19th century anxiety over identity. Along with other cultural products, Arctic literature reifies constructions of national identity, race, gender, and class. First-hand narratives of exploration were filtered and reshaped into novels that more clearly enforced wider normative cultural values and incorporated concrete messaging about the importance of a British claim to the Arctic. Themes of racial difference, British nationalism, and class hierarchy are woven into the fabric of these narratives, reflecting broader societal anxieties and aspirations within the empire. Sorry, this is going to be a little bit graphic, but a telling episode from The Doomed Ship involves the pet dog of the sole female character, Oriana. Oriana's main role in the narrative is to temper the gruff nature of the men on board and bring out the Christian goodness of the protagonist, Meredith, who alone is able to hold on as one by one the other men lose themselves and die. Stranded in an ice-locked ship with only a few survivors, 3 remaining sailors, an Irishman, a Scot, and a grizzled slave trader from the Caribbean, cook and eat Oriana's dog. This episode lets the protagonist set himself aside from the sailors, who are already differentiated by class and origin, as the one good Christian Englishman. He reprimands them by saying, quote, "Ye are worse than cannibals, the only living creature she had to love and cherish, ye have stolen and butchered to gratify your gluttonous cravings." Beyond demonstrating the loss of gentleness that the survival condition brings out and amplifying the heroism of the protagonist, it also amplifies the sense that his morality is rooted in specifically his Englishness. The claim of worse than cannibals mirrors a common characterization of the Inuit in the novels, as well as a common fear in tales of Arctic exploration. Cannibalism was often a claim that the British made in order to racialize and disempower Indigenous people that they came into contact with as the empire expanded. Furthermore, there's a fear of survival cannibalism in British accounts of Arctic exploration, a real occurrence that was an ultimate taboo. Although still graphic, this episode lets the author deal with the topic in a controlled manner. It is filtered for an audience who is willing to accept that explorer Sir John Franklin was the man who ate his boots to survive in the Arctic tundra, but that largely rejected Captain John Ray's evidence that Britain's heroes resorted to eating each other. What I think is often missed in characterizations of the Arctic as a blank white space is the Indigenous presence there. Countless authors, both Victorian and contemporary, refer to the Arctic landscape as unpeopled, but interaction with Inuit communities are a defining aspect of the construction of the Arctic in the British public's imagination. As with other imperial incursions, these interactions were often written about as a means of establishing racial difference and domination. Paradoxically, at the same time, stereotypes of the Inuit were used as a means of bolstering British self-image. The people themselves were being erased from their land. While the Arctic was never deemed settleable, it was still claimed for the British through exploration, which involved the symbolic gestures of flag planting and naming. Furthermore, the rhetoric of exploration helped sustain the imperial impulse. Arctic media fed the same appetites as the other cultural products of the empire, as there was an increasingly strong notion of Britishness defined in relation to empire over the course of the 19th century, formed through consumption and creation of cultural products related to the periphery. So while by the mid-19th century, the motivation of the exploration and claiming of the Arctic for Britain had very little to do with the economic impetus of empire, they are still manifestations of the hunger for domination and expansion through physical and symbolic acts. This can be seen in how the Arctic was used as a setting where identity was formed through visualization and construction of difference of the British self from Indigenous people, and in the characterizations of the landscape. This specific image of the Arctic as a sort of theater for imperial fantasies crystallized in the minds of the British public through repeated exposure in media. Ultimately, the fictional narratives of Arctic exploration serve not only as entertainment, but as a tool to reinforce normative social structures and imperial ideologies in Victorian Britain. They were one constellation in the universe of Arctic media that boomed in the 19th century, but provide significant insight into the characterization of the Arctic in the period. Thank you.
So let me echo the thank yous for the labor of making possible this great intellectual feast to Adriana and Thomas and Jeremy and Michelle and probably many other people who I don't know. And also, in addition to acknowledging that we gather here on the ancestral lands of the Lenape, I want to express my gratitude to diverse Native communities, past and present, whose knowledge is the foundation of much of the research I'm presenting today. I will begin by quoting the words of Francisco Hernandez after his time on a research expedition in New Spain between 1571 and 1577, who did not express gratitude to the diverse Native communities whose knowledge was the foundation of much, indeed most of his research on plants and animals. He wrote, "I bore such great burdens for 7 long years. I will not talk of the perverse Indian guides, nor will I speak of their fraudulence or terrible lies, which caught me off guard more than once, how they played tricks on me, and how often did I get the properties and even the names of plants wrong, because I depended on false information from an interpreter. The sullen guides and the inept servants, the ingenuity of the Indians in the wild, who could not be persuaded to reveal a single secret of nature." In New Spain, Hernandez directed a massive project that resulted in over 3,000 entries for plants and more than 400 for animals, with both text and images. And in these words, he revealed a fundamental paradox of early modern science. Europeans' desire for knowledge from Indigenous Americans, the ones he called the guides, the interpreters, and their denigration of these same people. His self-pitying lament is also a trace of the epistemological innovations that resulted from Indigenous knowledge, as well as European colonists' efforts to possess this knowledge while denigrating the people who produced it. It also suggests that given his commitment to the erasure of native labor, it is incumbent on scholars to develop methodologies to reverse the effects of such disavowals. And so in today's paper, I'm going to be talking a bit about some previous research and then building on it from there. And so more about all of this in a minute. So I'm going to begin by giving you a quick description of the 3 projects that I want to bring together. So I'll say more about these in a second. And then in the second part, I'm going to be focusing on the sort of clues that come by focusing on a single kind of specimen, here the Quetzal bird, that I think allows us to overcome the kind of disavowal that we saw in Hernandez and show that these projects are much more interlinked than have been previously understood. So those scholars have long recognized the centrality of Nahua labor in the production of these projects. I'm going to argue that when we adapt methodologies elaborated by Jacques Derrida and Carlo Ginzburg and build on my earlier work on microhistories, we can discern clues and follow traces that reveal both indigenous and colonial epistemologies. So first, let's go to the first part, and I want to just quickly explain this is, oops, going backwards. A little bit. Oh, no, sorry. Struggling with the directionality here. Okay, so the Tonalamat is the Nahuatl term for what we sometimes refer to as codices. And these were composed of either deer hide skin or amate paper in sort of this screenfold accordion style. And they had a number of different functions. One of them was as a tonal poali, which means the count of days, and would be used as sort of divinatory almanacs. And here it's showing a portion that shows a 13-day period that the Spanish labeled as a trecena. And it has some other components as well that I'll be talking to a little bit later. So there's only a small extant corpus of these that were produced prior to conquest, about 5 of them, and I'll be talking about 2 of them, the Codex Borgia pictured here, and then the Codex Fehervari-Meyer. So this tradition ended with the arrival of the Spanish in a certain way, but was continued in other ways. But I'll be focusing on those that were created prior to the Spanish arrival. So the second set of projects are those known probably to many of you as the Florentine Codex. And this here is the entry on the Quetzal bird, both in its final version and also an earlier draft. And this earlier draft became really important in this research. And then the third project is the work of Francisco Hernandez, or, somewhat the work of his, as I'll argue there's a lot more involved, particularly focusing on the section on animals, the history of animals of New Spain, which was composed of 5 treatises with 414 chapters. A little bit more about this, as I mentioned already, Hernandez was in New Spain for 7 years. 3 of them he was traveling around with a large indigenous entourage of the interpreters and guides, and also painters who he trained, showing them European natural history books, but made by indigenous artists. And again, here is the entry on the Quetzal in 2 versions that I'll be talking about later that survive. One we could refer to as a draft, and the other one a published version. So I'm not going to go into detail about it today, but I want to make clear that Hernandez's work had a huge influence within Europe and was inspiring for people like Carlos Clusius and Aldrovandi and other natural historians that we've heard about already today. And though none of it was published during his lifetime, it circulated in numerous books, and also the most complete version was in this 1648 work that I already showed. So now I want to move towards the traces and how those can reveal more about the both indigenous agency and epistemology and the relationship between these projects. So, moving ahead here. So the first trace that I want to focus on, and this is really where a lot of this research generated from, is I noticed that the entry on the Quetzal, that a number of the entries in Hernandez and in the Florentine Codex had details in common that suggested more than just coincidence. And the one where this was most obvious was in the Quetzal entry. And so so when I first looked at it, so this here we're looking at the Florentine Codex Quetzal entry and the entry in Hernandez, and I had sort of assumed that he would have been copying from the Spanish into Latin. So he's writing in Latin. The Florentine Codex, as you can see here, has columns in Nahua and Spanish as well as illustrations. But when I looked more closely at the text, it became clear that in fact someone was translating into the Latin from the Nahuatl. And so that this is where the comparisons had to be made. So what I have here are two, side by side, the text from the Nahua of the Florentine Codex, which was originally written circa 1565, even though the Florentine Codex wasn't completed until 1577. And then the English translation from the Latin that was produced by John Ray in 1678. And what became clear was that there was a real effort, even though he made some important adjustments, or someone made some important adjustments, there were some real efforts to sort of capture some of the effective qualities of the way the Quetzal tail feathers, and this is the part emphasizing on the tail feathers here. So in the Nahuatl, it describes them as the feathers as being green, herb green, very green, fresh green, turquoise colored, trying to capture the iridescent qualities through this repetition of certain words. And while the Latin and then English translation doesn't capture this exactly, you can see shining green and of a peacock color, trying to capture the sort of green turquoise aspects. And I should have shown you the pictures of the bird first, but we'll get to those in a second. Then in the Nahua, it goes on to compare the sort of shape of and the way that these feathers move to reeds. They are wide like reeds, the ones which glisten, which bend, they become green, they become turquoise. Again, capturing the sort of the way that the feathers and movement would work together. And Hernandez, again, doesn't exactly do this, but he compares it to the leaves of the fleur-de-lis, which in some sense for a European audience is an apt kind of translation, since this is another plant like a reed, whereas reeds have a lot of importance and a lot of prestige in Nahuatl that wouldn't translate for a European audience. So comparing it to a fleur-de-lis sort of captures some of the prestige that reed and Nahuatl would convey. And then the Nahuatl goes on to describe the tail of this one is black, dark. These feathers cover and underlie the Quetzali feathers. They are also green, glistening. These feathers are only on the interior side. They are rather long, smoky, blackish, sooty. They cover, they protect the Quetzali feathers. So emphasizing these sort of green and black feathers and a way that the black ones had this perhaps protective element. And this too is captured. And this was really the clue to me that the Latin was following the Nahuatl and not the Spanish, because this is not in the Spanish translation of the Nahuatl of the Florentine Codex, covered with other black ones, but beneath and where they touch the peacock colors or purple ones, which are in the middle, inclining to green, as if nature took care of the beauty of the middle feathers, sort of capturing the idea of the black ones being protective. And so noticing this clue, it led me to ask some other questions, which is, why was this the entry that Hernandez copied so completely in comparison with all of the others? And why does the Quetzal entry itself within the Florentine Codex have a degree of sort of repetition and description that is unsurpassed? And at some level, this was a very easy question. The second question was not that complicated to answer because the Quetzal bird has an unparalleled importance in not only Nahuatl culture, but Mesoamerican culture over the longue durée. So you can see this in all sorts of visual traces. It's important here in headdresses, portrayed on this mural at Teotihuacan, in sculpture showing these warriors wearing Quetzal feathers, here as important tribute items during the rule of the Mexica or the Aztecs, and even in surviving artifacts, this one today in the Vienna Museum. But I want to focus a bit more fully on why the exact mode of description that we see in the Florentine Codex. And I think for that, you have to look in the relationship between Book 1 and Book 2 of the Florentine Codex, which focuses on gods and religion, and then in the Book 11, which is on natural history. And so what we see here is an early draft of Book 1 of the Florentine Codex, which is focusing on different gods, which is, as you can see, a very rough kind of copy of the section of the Tonalamato, which is showing the different gods. And over here in a later chapter describing the work of feather workers in Florentine Codex. But it's this that I really want to focus on. So you can see here how this is an image of the deity Tezcatlipoca, that the image doesn't really capture, you know, the complexity of the earlier imagery in the Tonalamat. But when you turn to the textual part, you can see that with the use of alphabetic writing, there was an effort to sort of convey in text what is lost a little bit in the pictorial description. And because of time, I won't read all of this right now, but much of the sort of mode of description that we see in the natural history section actually emerges from these descriptions that are more focused on ritual and spirituality in describing the way the Quetzal feathers work in composing the image of one of these deities. So to sort of conclude this first section, sorry, what was the time? Remaining? Okay. So I'm taking longer than I expected. So I just want to emphasize, here that by focusing on the Quetzal trace, we're able to see the connections between these three kinds of sources in a way that you couldn't see without it. So what I wanted to spend a lot more time on, but because of my poor timing, I won't, but I'll just quickly allude to, is a second kind of trace, which has to do with a really important discrepancy between the two surviving versions of Hernandez's natural history. And this has to do with the ordering. So in the draft of the natural history, the Quetzal is first, which doesn't surprise me at all, given what I've said already. In the sort of revised version, a bird Huactan, or the female, or Huactli for the male, which has been identified as a black-crowned night heron, is first, and the Quetzal is second. So I really, really struggled to understand why this might be so. And ultimately, going back to the Tonalamat, what I decided was that a certain part of the Tonalamat, which is referred to as the cosmogram, could be read as an ecological diagram, and that a notion that roughly corresponds to our idea of ecosystem is being conceptualized in these. So what we have is east, south, west, north, which east and south tracking with our ideas of sort of tropical ecosystems, and north and west, kind of the high altitude desert plateau. And that the Quetzal bird is the sort of exemplary bird that is here, and I'll show a little bit with a different version of the cosmogram, where the Quetzal is paired with a flowering tree with a vine, a quintessentially tropical sort of pairing of ecology here. And so that the Quetzal is the sort of representative of this ecology. And then And the cosmograms have different kinds of, they're not always consistent. In the Quetzal is consistently the one that represents the east. The west, there are different versions. And this one, it's a raptor on a agave or maize plant. But then the night heron is actually a representative of this high desert plateau, and both of them in the wet season. So there's a sort of seasonal aspect as well. So that what we have in the end with Hernandez's work, didn't make it on the last one. Oh, I guess I had it somewhere else. But there should be one more. I wanted to conclude with this picture. It's not advancing. Is actually a representation of the cosmogram. Oh, yeah, here it is. On that first page, which is showing the uncredited work of Nahua scholars who I think were helping him do the translation, who were able to, you could say, even smuggle in a depiction of the cosmogram through the juxtaposition of the heron and the Quetzal. Thank you.
I may have over-prepared with my comments, but I'll do my best to keep them within the bounds of reason and give lots of time for discussion, questions and answers, and that sort of thing. So thanks for giving me the opportunity to comment on these papers. I thoroughly enjoyed reading them, and I enjoyed the presentations even more. So to begin with, all of these papers originate in the context of empire. Empires provide the resources for scientific and natural history work, right, for coordinating logistics, marshalling expertise, and so on. At the same time as all these papers make abundantly clear, empires are also suffused with material and cultural inequities, right? Whether we're talking about 19th century Britain or 19th century America and India, right, or 16th century Mexico. Marcy and Alexander both draw attention quite clearly to the inequities of labor and knowledge in their analyses, which also, of course, pertain to contexts of overt hegemony and direct imperial control. Despite these inequities, Marcy's paper, I thought, right, through a beautifully fine-grained analysis of the Florentine Codex and the Mexican Treasury, that's the version I got to read, argues, I think, quite convincingly for the salience of indigenous epistemologies and also for the 16th century as a crucial turning point in the making of modern understandings of science. And this is a very useful counter to Northern European and especially Anglo-centric narratives of 17th century scientific advancement, right, which tend to place a lot of emphasis on metropolitan individuals and institutions, right, as the driving force behind these changes. And this particular line of argument, of course, is not exactly new per se, right? It harkens back most notably to Cañizares-Esguerra's How to Write the History of the New World. But it's an argument that still very much needs to be made because the inertia of these Eurocentric, white-centric, and Anglo-centric scientific revolution narratives is still very much there. And I'm currently reviewing a book that exemplifies those narratives perfectly. So needless to say, I'm reviewing it very critically, but also, needless to say, any historical narrative such as Marcy's that decenters Europe and decenters the North Atlantic in the history of science and recenters indigenous cultures and knowledges can't be proclaimed loudly or often enough. This relationship of direct imperial control is somewhat less firmly established in Eleanor's essay. And Eleanor, of course, is describing a context in which there's an attempt by British intermediaries to make a claim to the Arctic that is not otherwise self-evident, and a lot of this work was accomplished through aesthetic representation. So I'm reminded here of a lot of work by, really wonderful work by Mary Louise Pratt, Beth Fawkes-Tobin, and others, which point to the very insidious roles played by aesthetic representations, right, which Pratt aptly refers to as anti-conquest narratives. Eleanor's essay also makes several references to the British public and to Britishness, which I thought was interesting. There's a long debate in British historiography regarding the extent to which imperial narratives and imperial identities were in fact broadly taken up by the British reading public or the British public more generally. And Bernard Porter most famously points to the difference in social class. It was primarily the bourgeoisie who were really invested in these notions of empire and not so much the working class. So I'm curious where you stand on that. And this also dovetails with reception histories of scientific publishing, which I'm very familiar with, and some of us might be familiar with as well, work by Adrian Johns and numerous others. So I've only got a couple minutes here, so I'll just make space for a couple more comments. So on the subject of empire, Clayton's discussion of Marmaduke Burroughs' capture of a rhinoceros reveals, of course, Burroughs' dependence on existing British imperial networks and British imperial hegemony in India. And I wondered throughout this paper about the relationship between British and American conceptions of knowledge and empire. And in formulating this question, I'm reminded of the work of Susan Scott Parrish, Ralph Bauer, and others who have drawn attention to the ways in which colonial figures in the Americas, through the late 18th century, vaunted empirical methodologies and also their direct access to direct experience as a distinct knowledge-making advantage vis-a-vis the metropole. And I didn't detect any of this per se in Burroughs, but I do wonder if there's any self-consciousness on his part regarding the fact that he was an American piggybacking on British imperial knowledge networks. And this is also, of course, very immediately preceding the Wilkes expedition in 1838, the American exploring expedition of the Pacific, which is certainly a watershed moment in the making of American science and empire and American imperial identity. So maybe Burroughs is part of a making of that watershed moment. I don't know. You would know better than me. I'm curious to know more on that score. I do have to wrap up here. I had lots more to say, but I'm curious to know, let me see if there's anything else further that we can say about Indigenous and colonized labor in these essays. Particularly, this is something that comes across very directly in Marcy's paper. So with respect to Clayton and Eleanor's papers, if there's any way that we can talk a little bit more about Indigenous perspectives and Indigenous knowledges that kind of push against these imperial representations, I'd be very interested in knowing more about that. And one final comment, I do wonder if the word decolonization is something that is useful for thinking about the work that we're trying to do. This is, there are different ways of thinking about decolonization. There's kind of the gold standard of directly repatriating land and labor and resources. But there's also different, more expansive ways of thinking about decolonization, including making sure that our work dovetails with the needs of the communities that we write about and speak about. I'm conscious of the fact that all these papers, they kind of stop at roughly the 20th century line, so they're not exactly contemporary, but maybe it's worth thinking about whether decolonization is a useful way of thinking about our work, or maybe about work that we want to do that kind of jumps off from the work that we're currently doing. So I'll leave it there, and we'll discuss further.
I guess in terms of Indigenous knowledge and your question on that, the first thing that comes to mind to me is it's actually more of a contemporary example because there's a renewed interest in the Arctic in terms of geopolitical sort of machinations. There's been a larger presence of the Canadian Army there, and there's been a lot of interaction with the Inuit community. And interviews that I've read regarding that, there is a memory of attempts to save these explorers through sharing knowledge of how to live in these environments that were ignored, and that led to the death of so many British explorers because they rejected that Indigenous knowledge because it was different from their own. So that's the first thing to me that comes to mind.
I'll respond to the kind of point about the American identity within all this. And it does come at a really interesting point in the 1830s where there's this huge American kind of commercial and diplomatic expansion as well. You know, the very fact that Marmaduke Burgh is a consul is a kind of symbol of that.
Alex,
but
can you hold the microphone? Yeah.
Oh, yeah?
That's great.
And I think, you know, in this period that American merchants in many ways can move more freely through the British Empire than British merchants can, and are able to often form far more successful kind of commercial relationships with the East India Company and move animals a lot more freely. So there does become this kind of growing confidence and this identity that this is something that they can do particularly well. And in terms of kind of decolonization, and really kind of, I don't think what my talk didn't necessarily do this, but kind of centering the indigenous worldviews that go against what Marmaduke Burgh and every scientist and naturalist is really doing in this period and in this place. You know, there are worldviews and beliefs, particularly around the rhinoceros. The rhinoceros is the animal that Lord Krishna rides into battle. It's a symbol of power. It's a very spiritual animal. And then the fact that this animal is being kind of hunted and extracted to extermination is you know, it shows those kind of two competing systems of power and views of power as well.
Thanks for those comments. So responding to whether this is a decolonizing project and where this takes us into the present, I have, I guess, two thoughts. I mean, the first is taking seriously the work of people like Kim Tallbear, who are very insistent that decolonizing is giving stuff back. I don't want to overstate what this is. I think it's a necessary starting point, and maybe me as a, you know, white person, descendant of settlers, I don't think I can claim to be decolonizing anything, but I think this is like correct history. I mean, I think what we consider European history is built on the labor and the epistemologies of indigenous people, and I actually disagree a little bit with your historiographic. I think in the sense, I think the earlier Iberian turn historiography that you referenced really emphasized the work of sort of Creoles, but not so much of indigenous labor and epistemology. And I think there's a lot more to be done in that area. In terms of its relevance for the present, I do think keeping in mind, you know, something like 5% of lands are held by indigenous people today and represents about 80% of biodiversity. So just like understanding that there is actually a connection between, I believe, between the sort of recognition and understanding of ecological concepts and the actual reality of biodiversity in the past, and that awareness of that should guide, you know, policies writ large in terms of you know, lands and so on, and fighting against extractive projects. How directly, you know, early modern work. Yeah, I don't know exactly that you need that. I think the relevance of the early modern work is more for understanding, in some ways, European history. I mean, the work that I'm doing. So thank you.
So I can open it up to questions if anyone has a question.
Yeah, I have a question for Eleanor. So what stood out to me in your talk, I mean, is in every other talk, there's been something biological, right? There's been something, you know, we've looked at herbaria, we've looked at birds, go birds. But what you're looking at with the Arctic is inherently elemental. We're looking at ice, we're looking at cold. And I'm wondering if there's something in that difference between like different, I guess it's a difference in taxonomy or something, where we're looking at elements, we're looking at water and ice and cold, and not something that's living. So do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's an interesting thing to think about in terms of also how the Arctic is being written about now. Someone like Barry Lopez writing about the Arctic, he grounds his understanding of the landscape in detail, because often in these earlier characterizations, the flora and fauna have been ignored for these more sweeping Gothic versions, comparing icebergs to cathedrals and things like that. So I definitely think there is a place for that. I just think in what I was looking at, it wasn't coming up as much. I also looked at whaling too, because I think, there's obviously that interaction happening. And often when explorers did get rescued, it was by people who were whaling. So I think that's an underexplored relationship. But I definitely think there's something about a landscape that is, elementally different from your own that leads to some of these issues of representation.
We have one over here, and then we'll come to this side of the room.
Thank you so much for all these talks. I had a question for Alexander. I was very struck by the iconography of the rhinoceroses that you provided in your talk, and in particular, the image of the rhinoceroses in a cage. And I wondered if you could comment a little bit on this, because I find it very, intriguing that this image would be used and publicized, putting the bars in front of the animals. What was the meaning of that? Is it a kind of image that we see in other forms of publications at the time? Thank you.
Thank you. It's a really, the cage is everywhere, and we try so hard to ignore it, even today in our contemporary zoological displays. The whole point is to try and make captivity disappear. And I think that's very much something that we live under today with kind of naturalized zoological displays. I think in the 19th century, captivity is something that's maybe celebrated a little bit more. There are concerns about these touring menageries being safe, and people like P.T. Barnum will regularly kind of promote the fact that their tigers have escaped because they're so ferocious and that you should come and see them while they're still there. The other thing is purely economic, that showing the cage, more often than not, touring menageries have such high mortality rates that they advertise themselves by wagons or by cages rather than by animals. So that's often when the cage appears more prominently, is because you can't promise animals that will normally die within a number of months. I think this kind of, the move from the cage to kind of other larger forms of display is mirroring this kind of growing confidence to be able to govern animals as subjects rather than as objects, that the cage is something that really kind of confines this very bare life of an animal, and then sort of slowly loosening that control is really a symbol of even greater control and even greater forms of kind of governing life. Yeah.
So I have 3 more questions, and then I think we're going to have to call it, so go ahead.
Hi, this is a question for Marcy. I was really intrigued by the idea that the cosmogram sort of snuck into, Hernandez's text. And I was just wondering, do you think Hernandez knew that was happening, was purposely doing that? Okay. Or, I was just wondering, were there other, people helping him or giving him information that smuggled it in without his knowledge? But
Now I'm nodding because I don't think he was. I'm nodding because I'm glad you asked that, because I had planned to talk about that. So in the longer version of the paper, I actually look at how it works in the Florentine Codex, where it's really much more elaborated, where the birds are grouped into 4 paragraphs. I mean, there's more than 4, but the first, and they correspond very neatly with the east, south, west, north division. And so to me, it's really a trace of the fact that there was overlap in the personnel working on those 2 projects. And I tend to think that he didn't know that it was. And again, in the sort of larger project, I also argue that the Florentine Codex, the final version, reflects the experiences of some of the people who were working with Hernandez and then finished the Florentine Codex. And in fact, the Florentine Codex sort of talks back a bit to Hernandez. So I feel like this is of a piece with that, where it's it's more smuggled in, and it's not something, because otherwise Hernandez does not at all adapt the sort of organizational structure that you find in the various, drafts of what becomes Book 11. Thank you.
I have a question about your personal experience in your research. There's a difference between reading about the ocean and going to the ocean. And have you had a chance to, each of you are talking about places and animals that live in an ecosystem in a place. Have you had a chance to go and explore these areas that you've been researching about? And how has your experience in those places shaped your thoughts about the topics?
I've seen the Indian rhinoceros in Nepal and kind of seen it in what may be constructed as a wild nature, which is really just kind of a increasingly large system of captivity that we now kind of control the natural world with. And then I've also, seen them in zoos, and I think my own experience in zoos has kind of prompted my research and just kind of troubles me every day. And the question of why and why we feel we have a right to go and see these animals, what the purpose of these displays are versus what we get from these displays, the systems that they continue to uphold around separating ideas of a kind of human culture from a passive, separate nature, they trouble me, and they're what kind of motivates my work, yeah.
I have not been to the Arctic. I think I have some qualms with the sort of, I guess the best term I can think of is ecotourism there. That's happening increasingly. I don't necessarily know that as someone who's not a scientist, and specifically as someone who's looking at representations of the landscape created in Britain, that it's, I don't want to use the word worth it, but worth the fuel for me to go there, basically. And also because, I don't see myself as a tourist in that landscape. I don't think that's an appropriate role for me to take. So yeah, no, I don't know if I'll ever go, and I probably won't.
Yes and no. I've been, so the sources I was talking about were produced in what is today Mexico City and the Tonalamat, probably in Puebla region, and I've spent time in both those places. But those are very transformed ecologically. But I would say I have experienced directly the kind of ecosystems that are being described. The high altitude desert, Arizona, New Mexico, has a lot in common with the areas that they're, I think, trying to depict in the cosmogram, and then tropical places in other regions. But I would say the relationship also goes in the other direction. My experience reading these texts and thinking about the Tonalamat and ecology through the pairing of sort of bird and tree and the kind of relationships have shaped my experience of how I, even sit in my backyard and look at trees and birds. So that the relationship it goes in both directions.
So we have one last quick question.
More a comment. The herbarium at the Academy of Natural Sciences has a significant number of plant specimens that were collected by Drummond on Lord Franklin's expedition in search of the Northwest Passage. The second one, which he returned from.
Great. So I think you'll have to make a field trip there. Okay. So with that, please join me in thanking this terrific panel of speakers for their papers.